on Friday. You're used to this. Anyway, welcome once more to the Schemel Forum. Yes. At a time in history when conflict and terrorism appear to be the order, or perhaps I should say the disorder, of the day, it's heartening to hear that some among us are focusing their attention, research, and action on resolving conflicts. Our speaker today is that kind of savior, not to use that word theologically. We need people, he can't go that far. We need people who work at the essential project of figuring out how people can live together in a world that is increasingly interdependent, and perhaps as a result, increasingly foreign. Many are feeling helpless, disaffected, and displaced. For most of history, people knew their place in the world, for better and worse, and now there's a sense of rootlessness and a loss of identity that is extremely uncomfortable and causing some desperate reactions. Cultures appear to be colliding with one another, and one of the results of that, in the absence of the conventional warfare, we find surprise terrorist attacks and a level of savagery that are causing enormous anxiety. So we need new-fashioned ways of dealing with conflict. And Brendan O'Leary, today's speaker, is a proponent, even a co-founder of some new-fashioned ways of resolving conflicts. As a result, he's been called upon to help in doing that, not only in Northern Ireland, famous in our time for the Good Friday Pact, but also in Iraq, Syria, Kurdistan, and Ukraine, to mention a few. His consultations include the UN, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, and I can only hope he is working on some resolutions here in the US. Dr. O'Leary is a Lauder Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Born in Cork, he spent part of his youth in Nigeria, Sudan, and Northern Ireland. Graduated from Keble College, Oxford, with highest honors. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you, Sandra, for that warm introduction. I'm a political scientist by trade. Political scientists share one thing in common with politicians, that is to say, we rarely open our mouths without subtracting from the sum total of human knowledge. I hope what I say this afternoon isn't classified in that way. I'm necessarily going to go over things very quickly and crisply. I look forward to being interrogated according to the standards of the Bill of Rights subsequently. So one of the most important things is what you're doing right now, sharing food. Sharing food precedes successful power sharing. If you want to be very good at conflict, I advise a very strict and rigorous diet. By contrast, one of the dangers of power sharing is you expand, and that's my apology for my current physical condition. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, define some terms related to national and ethnic conflict, discuss contemporary theories of what lies behind such conflict, and cast some cold water on some currently fashionable doctrines. Then I'll look at ways in which these kinds of conflicts can be successfully regulated through power sharing, and what types are particularly successful. And then I'll conclude with some short remarks about three particular places that are in the news, and one place which fortunately is no longer regularly in the news, namely Northern Ireland. So let's begin with our vocabulary, because unless we agree on what we're talking about, we'll have difficulties. Ethnicity and nationality are terms surrounded by a great deal of terminological disagreement. For me, the narrow use of ethnicity is the one that I will typically employ. The narrow use of ethnicity is groups that believe that they are descended from common ancestors. Yes, we all go back to the same ancestress somewhere in Central Africa, but the key conviction of an ethnic group is that its members are those broadly descended from common kin. So Kurds versus Arabs in Iraq is an ethnic conflict. Neither group believes that they share common ancestors. Usually, of course, there's a relationship between kinship relationships and culture, but that isn't always necessarily true. The broad use of ethnicity is now very common, particularly in the United States. It's used to cover every non-sexual and non-class-based difference. That's not the way I'll be using the term, though one can understand how that extension happens. So the term ethnic group comes from the Greek, ethnos. Interestingly, it has almost exactly the same meaning as the Latin term natio. Both refer to a group of common descent. So the usage of the two words in our languages is not surprising. But I think we have to account for why we now talk so frequently of ethnicity. And the answer is very straightforward. We used to talk of race, and race is now politically unacceptable, both for very good reasons and perhaps arguably for unfortunate reasons, because there is something to the importance of phenotypical contrasts in human conflict. So we use ethnicity today. If you read a 19th century history book, the word race, you can substitute the way we use ethnicity today. We should not confuse ethnicity with minority, which is a particularly American and indeed British fixation. The majority is also frequently ethnic. The majority too has common descent and or shared cultural characteristics. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, nicely defined ethnic groups as those that entertain a subjective belief in their common descent. Notice, it's not important what the truths of DNA suggest. All that matters is that these beliefs are widely held. So ethnic membership, unlike literal kinship, depends upon a presumed rather than an actually demonstrable genetic relationship. So let's think now about nation as opposed to ethnicity. If we think about our contemporary world, one of the frequent problems on the broadcasting media is the conflation of the word nation with the word state. That's particularly common among Americans, and it's particularly common also among the French. It's not the only thing the Americans and French have in common, despite some claims to the contrary. So the simplest way of making this clear is to contrast nation states with multinational states, and to contrast those in turn with non-national states. There are a whole plethora of nation states in the world. One can argue it's the contemporary political template. And the idea is that there is one people linked to political sovereignty in its state, and that people is defined as a nation. That very notion is both the root of tremendous successes, including democratic successes, and the root of tremendous conflict for those in particular who don't identify with the nation in question. But it should not be forgotten that the world is full of multinational states. Full of is an exaggeration, but there are significant numbers of multinational states. And broadly speaking, the bigger a place is, the more likely it is to be multinational in social character, even if it isn't formally multinational in political character. The place where I lived a lot of my life is not England, it is not Britain, it is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Its very title advertises not only archaic monarchical qualities, but the coexistence of multiple national communities. And of course, lastly, there are non-national states, dynastic states. To be a Saudi Arabian is not some particular kind of Arab. It is to be named for the dynasty. It is as if I was English, that I went around calling myself Windsorian. So that kind of dynastic identity is largely disappearing in the contemporary world, and so are, with a few perhaps contestable exceptions, theocratic states which define themselves non-religiously. The one of most relevance to the citizens in the neighborhood, of course, is the Vatican, which is not a national state, though at various times the Irish have tried to colonize it unsuccessfully. So the way I'll use nation is that, and I'm here following the Scottish philosopher David Miller, a nation is a mass collective community that has shared collective beliefs about its shared historical past, which is perceived, it may not be accurate. And very importantly, a nation has to conceive of its membership as sharing a collective future decision-making capacity. Distinctively, a nation claims to have its own homeland and to be characterized by a distinctive public culture. Note that you do not necessarily have to have a common language to be a nation, but you do have to have some kind of shared distinctive public culture. In short, a nation either has or seeks political status. It either seeks to govern itself or it seeks to co-govern itself along with other nations in a shared state. So, this terminological clarification, or further confusion as you prefer, is intended to answer the simple question: what is the difference between a nation and an ethnic group? I give you 6 potential answers, all of which I believe to be valid, but do contest me if you like. Nations can be composed of multiple ethnic groups, but the converse is not true. Nations are or seek to be mobilized for national self-determination. Ethnic groups need not be. They need have no necessary political organization or ambitions. Nations have homelands. Ethnic groups may have lost theirs. They may have departed. They may be distinctively ethnic. They may be associated with some past place, but they don't have, some of them don't have homelands in any meaningful sense. Nations necessarily require that there be people you can identify who say that they are members of that category. That's not necessarily true of ethnic groups. They may be defined by the observers rather than by evident collective beliefs. More controversially, nations are modern. I was educated by a famous man called Ernest Gellner, who is perhaps the father of the modernist theory of nationalism, the idea that nations are largely post-Reformation, post-Renaissance, post-industrialization phenomena. They are not features of the agrarian and pre-modern world. That view is contested, particularly by those who believe their nations go way back into antiquity, but it's a widely held view in the academy. By contrast, we have had ethnic groups ever since we differentiated in the African continent. The group characteristic of the human is at least as frequent as the individualism is part of human nature and activity. And lastly, nations are associated with the doctrine of nationalism, that to each nation there should be a nation state, or alternatively, a political entity in which that nation shares power equally in a multinational state. That's an express doctrine. Nationalism does not have to be associated with collective hatred of other groups. That is the way the term is frequently used. Sometimes people talk of patriotism as a good thing and nationalism as a bad thing. That is normative language. I don't particularly find it helpful. Nationalism is associated with both phenomena, loyalty to a particular nation state, and it can be associated with negative aggression, hostility, and discrimination towards others, but not necessarily. By contrast, there is no philosophy of ethnicism. There is what we all see from time to time, ethnocentric behavior, group-centered behavior, but there isn't a philosophy attached to ethnicism in the same way as that we can talk about a philosophy attached to nationalism. All that's necessary to define what I mean by national and ethnic conflicts. So national conflicts are where there is express division and conflict over who should run the state, the government, the public sector, who should run public and private institutions in their name, and what status should be attached to political institutions. So it's a key matter frequently in national conflicts. Who gets recognized? Does the state belong to everybody? Look at that title, The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Great Britain is an entity. It consists of the Union of Scotland of Scotland and England. It does not include Wales. Wales does not get parity of esteem in the title of the state, something which I would protest about vigorously if I was a Welshman. But fortunately for the British state, I'm not a Welshman. So there can be trivial forms of parity of esteem. There can be more significant forms of parity of esteem. Look at the flag of the United Kingdom. It integrates the cross of St. George, the cross of St. Andrew, and the cross of St. Patrick, not noticeably the cross of St. David, if there is a cross of St. David. So there can be symbolic conflicts, there can be more important conflicts over who controls public bureaucracies, who controls political institutions more broadly construed. Ethnic conflicts, by contrast with national conflicts, don't have to be focused on challenging the nature of the state and its symbolic associations. Ethnic conflicts can be characterized by distributive conflicts over what shares particular groups should get and to what they should be entitled. But if they remain ethnic conflicts, they will not characteristically pose the threat of secession. They could, but at that juncture, the relevant ethnic group is becoming a national group that seeks self-government. What's fundamental about these kinds of conflicts is, of course, and you know that they characterize much of the contemporary world, they are either resolved through coercion or they're resolved through breakup, secession, or partition, not the same thing. But I want to emphasize, and I'm going to talk about this today, they can be resolved by autonomy or power-sharing settlements. Or, of course, they're not resolved. They persist and are the result of and result in sustained and protracted conflicts. So, let's stand back a bit from that necessarily brief introduction. If we think about how governments can respond to the presence of ethnic and national difference, we can simplify the entirety of modern history in this graphic. On the left-hand side, we have end. Governments' strategies are to eliminate national and ethnic difference. On the right-hand side, we have the disposition to manage ethnic and national difference. Genocide, of course, is the most extreme form of elimination of difference, the ambition to eliminate a whole people. But it's related to and found often in common with the effort to expel people from a given territory. We Americans expelled the Native Americans and then proclaimed the brotherhood of man. That's not an untypical form of behavior. You can also eliminate differences by trying to restructure territories, either by partitioning territories so that subsequently all of the subsequent units will be more internally homogeneous, or a government may decide to permit a secession in order to avoid all the difficulties and complexities of power sharing with cultural others. Assimilation is, of course, a profound part of American history, at least part of American white history. The deliberate promotion of group unification, achieved most successfully when the relevant groups intermarry successfully and fuse culturally. Lastly, and most frequently in terms of rhetorical preference found today among liberal democratic governments, there is the notion of integration. In integration, we are all to be equal citizens, but entitled to preserve our separate cultural identities in the private domain. Our religion is privatized. Our language may not be the language of the public domain, but it isn't illegalized. Kurds, for example, had their language illegalized in contemporary Turkey up until a small number of years ago. So integration is the formula of equal citizenship and privatization of difference. But it does involve the elimination of difference from the public domain, which is why I put it on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side of the screen, you have the strategies that governments adopt if they seek to manage difference. The first of these is the most common in human history. It's not a an egalitarian approach to groups. Rather, it's hierarchical. One group or coalition of groups organizes itself and disorganizes the others. So that's characteristic of most of the empires that have been in existence in human history. It's also frequently found in many democracies in which the relevant ethnic minorities may well find themselves excluded from positions of esteem, excluded from key positions in the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Democracy is quite compatible with the tyranny of the majority. So control should not be identified solely with non-democratic institutions. Arbitration is something that many of you will be familiar with in a legal context, the idea of somebody arbitrating the differences between two litigants or two disputants. The unfortunate thing about the collective human species today is that we don't have arbitration institutions. If you like, in the monarchies of the past, if the monarchy was associated with every group, it was feasible for the monarchy to play the role of arbitrating group differences. In contemporary Morocco, my understanding is that the king is the result of a deliberate strategy. The king is married to a Berber princess, and his predecessor was also the product of a marriage between a prince and a Berber princess. So the monarchy fuses the peoples in its person and therefore can impartially act on behalf of all. Historically, there was a famous West African president who had mistresses with each of the 7 ethnic groups, and it was said he could perform as an arbiter because he had every group in the country. Now, we can't extrapolate from this possibility a role model for how, and an institution for how ethnic relations should be successfully managed. More seriously, we can sometimes make courts and other institutions to which we appoint outsiders sometimes perform short-term roles of arbitration. But it's difficult to think of arbitration as a wholesale governmental system. If you have outsiders doing it to you, you are governed under a trusteeship. That's roughly speaking the relationships between Bosnia and Herzegovina, the European Union, and NATO today. The other 3 kinds of arrangements are the ones that we need to focus on if we are thinking about how to avoid the horrors that can be attached to strategies of elimination. Namely, territorial pluralism, which includes certain kinds of multinational federation. Centripetalism, which I won't talk about much today, which involves organizing electoral and other institutions to induce people to believe that there are rewards for being moderate towards other ethnic groups. But I'm happy to take questions on that. The last is a system of politics known as consociation, which involves 4 principles: parity between groups, proportionality, each group gets represented in accordance with its numbers and receives benefits in accordance with its numbers. Autonomy, each group governs its own culture in its own way, subject to shared constitutional provisions. And lastly, each group has veto rights over major constitutional change. Broadly speaking, if the world is to be slightly better than it currently is, we need a move from the elimination strategies to the better kinds of management strategies. It is not the case that I'm saying that all forms of elimination are wrong. If there is voluntary assimilation, who can object to it? It's coercive assimilation which is wrong, not voluntary assimilation. Political integration often works with migrants. Most of us here, in some sense, are descendants of migrant communities. The condition of citizenship was that you were granted citizenship in return for, I remember when I signed my citizenship papers, I had to renounce princes and potentates. Today you can have dual citizenship, so I wasn't comprehensively abandoning my Irish citizenship. But that renunciation of a potentate should remind you that you were renouncing the authority of the Pope. if you were becoming a citizen in the United States in the 19th century. So there are ways in which integration can work, but frequently in the contemporary world, integrationist and assimilationist solutions are coercive and generate negative responses from the affected minorities. So let's spell out the empirical consequences of what I've been talking about. If we look at the wars in the world since the Napoleonic period, since the Congress of Vienna, only 1 in 5 of the wars in the world, which resulted in 1,000 deaths in battlefields, were the result of national conflicts or ethnic autonomy conflicts. But by contrast, in the last century, from the Treaty of Versailles up until 9/11, 9 out of 20 wars in the world were nationalist or ethno-national in character. And finally, since the period in history, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, over 3/4 of the wars in the world have been ethno-national in character. So those simple numbers, if you remember anything from the talk today, I'd like you to remember these simple numbers. 1/5, half, 3/4. That's the respective incidence of wars that are associated with national or ethnic conflict. Notice that I haven't included religion here. Sometimes it's associated with national and ethnic conflict, but explicitly religious conflicts, though they exist, have not been as frequent as wars based around nationality and ethnicity. So that's a stark set of indicators. The good news attached to this is that there are far less interstate wars today than there were historically. And most conflicts are inside states. But most of those conflicts have a national or ethnic character, and therefore those are the ones that we need to think about addressing. How do my fellow professors address these questions? Well, there are those who are species pessimists, who think that we are basically cavemen with slightly better dress sense than our ancestors. We are primordially ethnic, loyal to those who are our genetic kin and not others. We are killer apes, as some of them suggest. I don't want to deny that human nature is capable of appalling crimes. It would be a fool who denied that. But plainly, we also have tremendous cooperative capacity. And it's clear that throughout the historical record that there's variation in the extent to which we are conflictual and the extent to which we're cooperative. So although this may appear to be insightful, I don't think it tells us about what can be done. There are also cultural pessimists, not genetic pessimists. The late Samuel Huntington told us that we were going into a world of a clash of civilizations after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He predicted that most conflicts would take place at the borders of civilizations. He is like another Sam, Osama bin Laden. They're both dead, and I think they're both wrong. The idea that most of the conflicts in the world are between civilizations is, I think, simply wrong, and I'll try and explain why in a moment. The third school of thought is the one that has most policy influence. It's generated by people who have done a lot of economics. And one of them was, in fact, my economics tutor in Oxford University, a man called Paul Collier, who is very bright, but I don't agree with what he says. He and others associate contemporary civil wars primarily with greed rather than grievances, primarily with the opportunities given to insurgent organizations to loot natural resources and other kinds of mobile and transferable resources. They think that we should not assume that what appear to be ethnic and national conflicts are such. They're skeptical about the idea that most of the conflicts in the world have these characteristics. Some indeed see the claims made for ethnicity and nationality as mere fronts, facades for, in effect, criminal enterprises. This view is popular among policymakers. It allows you, of course, to dismiss all of these insurgent organizations when they're not being deemed terrorists and therefore beyond the pale of civilization, if they're criminal enterprises, again, why should you engage with them? Why should you seek to address their grievances if you believe they're manufactured? A few words on the idea that our conflicts are civilizational. Some of you may remember the famous Mahatma Gandhi. Well, Mahatma Gandhi in 1931 went to Lancashire in England, and a journalist stopped him and said, "Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of English civilization?" Gandhi paused for a moment, and he said, "I think it would be a good idea." Civilization is an inherently judgmental character. But it doesn't take an enormous brain to work out that civilizations are not collective subjects. If you believe they exist, they're not collective subjects. There's no committee for the civilization of the Christian powers. You can't interpret NATO like that. You might want to, but you can't. There's no committee for the civilization of Buddhist powers. To the extent that there are civilizations, they're not collective subjects that go to war with one another. Moreover, there is no civilization that is not inherently pluralistic and that does not overlap with other ones. Judeo-Christian and Islamic civilizations share in common a monotheistic Abrahamic faith. That overlaps. Indeed, it's a doubtful axiom that they all share in common. So you can identify across civilizations shared traits. You can identify profound internal differences within civilizations. It is rarely true that the incidence of conflict in the world is highest at the places where you can spot the interfaces of civilizations. So I would emphasize to you that you should not buy these kinds of doctrines. Even when we think today about the role of Islamic jihadists, their scope and their power is most profoundly evident, I would argue, in Syria and Iraq. They're present elsewhere, from Nigeria and Mali to other locations. But by and large, it is still true that there is far more conflict in the world associated with national and ethnic conflicts than there are conflicts between cosmopolitan jihadists and others. But I'm very sure you'll want to get back to me on that theme. If we look at the skeptics, those who say these conflicts are not about nationality and ethnicity, let's think through the logic of what their position implies. Their position is that groups and their rebel leaders are taking advantage of the weaknesses of states to loot and steal and grab collective and natural resources. The implication is that the way to solve the question is to have stronger, more centralized and states with better repressive capabilities. I satirize this as the view that what's required are better helicopters, because famously insurgents can hide from helicopters. The implication as well is that you should incentivize governments and public policy to disperse groups, to weaken the possibility that they will be preyed upon and exploited by ethnic group leaders. You should disperse the relevant groups, which can, of course, sound like a recipe for certain kinds of ethnic expulsion. The idea behind these policies is strongly economic. It implies that we're largely driven by the bottom line. So you should engage in all sorts of policies that make it difficult for rebels to hide their money. You should create all sorts of incentives to pay informers, and so on and so forth. Now, this worldview isn't completely odious. Most of the people who advocate it are strongly in favor of good governance, transparency, public integrity in office, and so on. But I think fundamentally they miss the point, and they miss the evidence that these kinds of policies don't work. That centralization, heavy policing, and efforts to disperse groups are if anything, likely to provoke conflict rather than to resolve it. Those of you who have more liberal dispositions are likely to believe that grievances matter more than greed, as Paul Collier would phrase the contrasting positions. Those of us who go and interview insurgent groups, those of us who go into conflict sites, who go to the places that the American satirist P.J. O'Rourke calls having holidays in hell, we report that groups do talk about grievances, that leaders appear to be deeply affected by them. Journalists do the same. I think it's about time the academy and policymakers caught up with reality. It's true that the kinds of explanations given by what I call the skeptics have some purchase. They can tell you, perhaps, why it's easier for some rebel groups to mobilize than others. If you don't have good mountains, if you don't have rough terrain, if you don't have the right kind of milieu to organize against a government, it's going to be more difficult for you than other groups. It's easier for Kurds to rebel than it is for certain kinds of South Sudanese against their respective governments. What I'd like you to do is to just engage in an experiment. We're all citizens here, I assume, and loyal, and we pay our taxes. And we think, in general, with criticism and grumbling, we think broadly well of our collective institutions. But governments can also be construed as illegitimate, as tax collecting for illegitimate purposes. And in this respect, they're no different from rebel organizations and rebel institutions. When rebels collect for their respective causes, the key question is, do they spend those resources on their relevant military struggle, or do they spend them on holidays in the Spanish Riviera or the Italian Riviera? Are they corrupt? And if they recycle most of their resources for the relevant conflict, I think that's the key indicator that they're serious about their relevant commitments. So I think we should not buy into the arguments of the skeptics. We should take the evidence of grievances seriously. Fortunately, there's now been a reaction to this school of thought within the academy. In all of this work, we, and I say we because I identify with those who take this line of thought, there are three particular things that matter in generating most of the internal conflicts that we're talking about. One is exclusion. The exclusion of a group from access to parity, access to a proportional share of resources, exclusion from rights of autonomy that it has sought. Everybody who's an educated American knows about the importance of exclusion in the history of African Americans in particular. The next thing that's absolutely critical is repression. Have you experienced repression at the hands of the government? Have the police broken into your family's home and engaged in illegal surveillance? Have you been interned without trial? Have relatives, friends been sent to jail for things for which they were not guilty? That's a predictable precipitant of conflict. And the evidence on this is quite overwhelming. Counterinsurgencies which repeat patterns of exclusion and repeat patterns of repression are engines for the creation of successful rebel groups. But I'd like to emphasize three particular patterns of ethnic conflict that contemporary data analysis shows us is critically important. First, I mentioned already, and I won't elaborate at any great length, the exclusion of some groups from equal treatment and proportional representation in key institutions. You can probably, simply by watching the media, know that that has been a key part of the history of contemporary Iraq and Syria. But a second phenomenon is less noticed and very powerful, and perhaps will be deeply appreciated by those of you who know something of the history of the American Civil War. A group that experiences a status reversal is likely to be incredibly violent. If a group is previously the top dog and is displaced from power as a result of an insurrection or as a result of a foreign intervention and goes down the status hierarchy, that group will react with incredible vigor and violence. So that's crudely how to understand the reaction of the Sunni Arabs of Iraq. It's how to understand the reaction of the Russian speakers of Ukraine. Even the fear of status reversal can be the precipitant of large-scale violence. So it isn't always the oppressed and the exploited and the historically excluded that are a source of key violence, but those who have just recently been privileged and dominant and are now being excluded from power that are a particularly strong source of violence. I'd like you to think about the Deep South after the American Civil War. A third pattern of violence in the contemporary period is competition for power within what is otherwise a coalition of rival ethnic groups. That too can be a source of violence as the terms of power are renegotiated. Contemporary Lebanon is perhaps a good example of that phenomenon. So, where does this kind of analysis lead one? What kind of conclusions come from this kind of analysis? Is the answer more democracy? Well, more democracy is not a bad thing, but it's mistaken to think that democracy in and of itself can settle all these questions. Democracy in its primitive meaning is understood widely throughout the world as majority rule. And in many places, majority rule is precisely the problem. The second way of thinking about resolving these kinds of conflicts is to promote multinational institutions, to make a state multinational rather than mononational, more like Canada, less like the US in character. Export Canada, don't export the US, especially if you're doing it at the point of a gun. Would that work? Well, there is evidence, I would suggest, that early and generous grants of territorial autonomy to culturally distinct groups has some record of working. It's not a surefire recipe for success, but it is associated with greater stability and greater endurance of good group relations. Consociational arrangements are different from federal arrangements because they're especially suited to groups that are mixed, that is to say intermixed, living together in the same cities and towns, sometimes in the mixed in village structures as well. Whereas federalism works quite well for strongly territorially concentrated groups, it has no distinct answer to the question of groups that are living cheek by jowl. Now, I've suggested crudely two formulae for power sharing in the presence of potential violence: multinational federalism and consociation. And you would be absolutely right to ask, does any of these particular recipes work? Are they successful? Do they make a difference? Well, I would like to summarize a whole swathe of literature for you as quickly as possible. And the way I'll do it is first to summarize rhetoric about these arguments, and then I'll quickly tell you about the evidence. Those who are skeptical of these solutions use the three great arguments that all reactionaries should use. If you ever feel like being a reactionary, and we all have children, and there's occasions when you should be a reactionary when you have children, there are three great arguments. It's futile. It makes no difference. It's perverse. It achieves the exact opposite of what you intend. And lastly, jeopardy. It endangers something that you deeply value. Those arguments are used against power sharing. It's futile. It makes no difference. It achieves the exact opposite of what is intended because it entrenches group identities and makes people more locked in to those collective communities than they were before, and therefore it exacerbates the problem. It jeopardizes existing institutional successes because instead of equality of opportunity and merit and descriptive criteria, we instead introduce group-based criteria which in effect, means that merit and efficiency considerations are less important. What do the other sides say rhetorically in contrast? Well, they say, let's be realistic. Group conflict is based on conflicts between groups. And if you're going to settle it, not only do individuals have to be content, but groups have to be content. Those who argue for power sharing say that there's a positive synergy between power sharing institutions, parity, proportionality, autonomy, and veto rights. They work together as a cluster of characteristics that can consolidate peace and stability. And lastly, they say they're natural. They're not made up in professors' heads. Look what happens throughout the world, where you have sustained conflicts where no side can militarily defeat the other. What emerges is some kind of power-sharing settlement. Where thought, advice, counseling can be given is on making sure that the content of that agreement that people make is a reasonably good one and one that can work. That's the rhetoric. What about the evidence? Well, the evidence is very clear that if your democracy has more power-sharing characteristics, parity between groups, proportionality, autonomy, qualified majority rules for changing the constitution, that democracy performs better than a majoritarian democracy on average, not only on things that matter to all of us, price stability, full employment, those wonderful things that used to exist, plus reduced income inequality, but soft things also, so-called soft things. Women's rights are better protected in power-sharing democracies. Health services are better in power-sharing democracies. So there is an argument, just confined to democracies, that the power-sharing democracies do better than the majoritarian democracies. If we look across all kinds of political system, Pippa Norris argues, irrespective of whether they're monarchies, autocracies, authoritarian party systems, or multi-party democracies, the more you have power-sharing characteristics present in the relevant political system, then the better off that state is against a range of developmental criteria. Lastly, and more fundamentally for our purposes today, if you have a conflict and you settle that conflict with a peace agreement, then if that peace agreement has power-sharing components, then you have a statistically robust, far less then there will be a statistically robust, far less likelihood that you will go back to war. These are strong pieces of evidence. So I put before you, like a savior and propagandist, that you'll have a better democracy, you will have better development, and you will have less likelihood of return to war if you embrace power-sharing characteristics. Now, that might sound like it's too good to be true, but it's statistical and it's on average. It's not saying that all conflicts can be solved. It's not saying that there are no cases of majoritarian democracies that function, but that on average, this repertoire of institutions works better to reduce conflict. If we look at the world in which we're living, the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, only less than 10% of conflicts over the last 25 years have been settled by military victory. The famous example is the Sinhalese government's victory over the Tamil Tigers. Militaries do not appear to be successful, no matter how well resourced, in crushing insurgencies in domestic conflicts. 1/4 of the conflicts since that time period have ended with peace agreements. Then there's a whole range of messy worlds in between these cases in which there have been imperfect peace agreements, cycles of ceasefires followed by efforts to achieve military victory on the field. And you'll see that 40% of conflicts remain unresolved. These are ones that are at least 5 years old. I think the implications of this picture are very strong. If I was advising a government, I would say that your probability of outright military victory is low. And therefore it makes sense to invest in how you work out a successful peace agreement. And if you're going to have a peace agreement, make sure it has the right components for it to be stable. So that's the broad-based stuff. Let me conclude with a few cases about conflicts in the news and how I think about these questions. You don't have to agree with anything I say. This is just for provocation and encouragement. So if we take Ukraine, Ukraine was a surprise in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union because people expected it to be immediately a site of conflict, because there are Russian speakers as well as Ukrainian speakers, because the Russians' sense of their homeland began in Kiev. They regarded Ukraine as part of their homeland. You will recall, I assume, because most of you look as if you're roughly the same age as I am, that Alexander Solzhenitsyn lived in the United States and went back to Russia and wrote a famous book. In that famous book, he advocated before the collapse of the Soviet Union that Russia should withdraw from the Soviet Union. But it should take northern Kazakhstan and Ukraine with it. Now that's not what happened, as we all know. The Soviet Union broke up around its constituent republics. And people were worried about Ukraine. So why has Ukraine now become a site of what might well be a protracted war? There's no simple answer to that, but finger pointing just in one direction isn't going to work. On the one hand, the current conflict directly results from the successful revolution against a corrupt Ukrainian president. But it also results from a coup d'etat against a freely elected Ukrainian president, not from a legitimate democratic process. Both interpretations are correct. The conflict in Ukraine has, the success of the revolutionaries led to a brief moment in which it appeared to be the case that the new government was intent on removing the language rights of Russians. And some even were foolish enough to suggest that Crimea's autonomy should be taken away. So they threatened status reversal for Russians. That triggered the reaction we all know about. If we look at the external relationships surrounding Ukraine, it is very common for our government and for European governments to place all the blame on Vladimir Putin, who is portrayed not only as a military and secret service genius, but a long-term planner. He's always been intent on doing this. I don't think that's an accurate account of what happened. What happened was arguably that the EU was intent on expanding into Ukraine, along with other post-Soviet space. But on this occasion, for the very first time, the EU tried to bring an entity inside it before the relevant entity had become part of NATO. That left it vulnerable. They had received multiple warnings from the Russian government that this was a security frontier for Russia of great importance. So our side, in my view, played a very risky role in Ukraine. They appeared to be supporting a coup. They appeared to be threatening Russian interests and ignoring them. And they sleepwalked into a conflict, assuming that Russia in today's times is just like the Russia of Boris Yeltsin, recovering from post-Soviet collapse. But whatever your view on the genesis of the conflict and how you attribute blame, and what I have just said should not be construed as some kind of apologia for Vladimir Putin, who is no Democrat. But however you construe it, you have to ask yourself, how could this question now be settled? You have, I think it's clear, only formulae that would hold the place together that would have to take a power-sharing set of characteristics. Ukraine has had for too long a powerful presidency, or a presidency that people wanted to make powerful. It could only be held by one majority. They need to get rid of a presidency and have a prime ministerial system together with a strong cabinet so that they can include people from all over the country. It's now unavoidable, I think, if Ukraine is to hold together, that they think seriously about federalism. The problem is, those are now the things being advocated by Russia. And that is often the problem in these kinds of conflicts. When the worst kind of person is advocating the correct solution, that puts the correct solution off the table. I learned, by the way, that's one of the important differences between American and Irish English, whether something is on the table or off the table. Those have different meanings. In any case, I think anybody who was tasked with the role by the United Nations or any equivalent good faith body would have to think about contemporary Ukraine in terms of a federal and power sharing settlement. If we take contemporary Iraq, avoid for the moment, just for the sake of argument, American moral debates about the causation of the American intervention. What happened in Iraq in 2005, I was a witness to it, I was an advisor to the Kurds, was the making of a constitution that could have remade Iraq as a pluralist federation. On paper, it was quite a reasonable settlement. What prevented it from working? Multiple things. But the key thing was the internal civil war among Arabs between Shiites and Sunnis. The Sunnis had been the top dogs in Iraq. They were displaced from power. The question was, how were they to be reincorporated? Could they be reincorporated? The Shiites were fundamentally of the belief that the Sunnis could not be successfully reincorporated. They had to be kept down. They had to be prevented from having their own security arrangements. They could not have their insurgents incorporated inside Iraqi security forces. Prime Minister Maliki was encouraged in his bid to reshape and manipulate and break the Iraqi constitution by two unholy sets of allies, the Americans and the Iranians. America and Iran, both for different reasons, sought to re-centralize Iraq. The Iranians, because they thought that the re-centralization of Iraq would now take place under the Shiite majority. The Americans, because they have believed on autopilot since 1980 that it's in America's interest to have a strong government in Baghdad to balance against Tehran, whatever the nature of that government. So curiously, the two biggest powers with a direct material impact on the region were both interested in re-centralizing Iraq and not respecting the constitutional settlement of 2005. Out of that soil, ISIS grew. Now, who knows whether Iraq can hold together or not, but if it is going to hold together, it requires that something like the settlement of 2005 be properly reconstructed, and that there be a pattern of both power sharing at the center and the full panoply of powers, regional powers, granted to Sunni Arabs in their areas. If that happens, Iraq has some prospects of success. It may well not happen. The probability of that being a successful and equilibrium outcome has diminished radically. And it's probably more likely that if Iraq has an immediate short-term negotiated future, Iraq will become confederal rather than federal in form. And it may well indeed break up. But it didn't have to. There were possibilities in its institutional architecture that might have made it work. Syria looks an even bleaker case for the prospects of power sharing. But I would put it to you that the profound sources of conflict there actually make some kind of power sharing pact the only outcome short of continuing war that is likely to materialize. Nobody can win in contemporary Syria because of the way things have panned out. The Sunni Arab-led opposition made a huge strategic error at the beginning of the Arab Spring. They said, we want to replace the Assad dictatorship, equal citizenship for all. But they refused, point blank, to make any specific group-oriented concessions to the Alawites, who had formed the dominant group in Syria since the Elder Assad came to power. They refused to make specific group rights commitments to the Druze. They refused to make specific group rights commitments to the Christians and also to the Kurds. If you add all that up, that's 35 to 40% of the country. So they made a huge strategic blunder in allowing the regime to make the minorities fear the Sunni Arab majority more than they feared the regime. And that's the fundamental domestic environment inside Syria. There are other complications, not least the Saudi and Qatari support for Islamic jihadists, largely concentrated in the Sunni community, and both Russia and Iran, for distinct reasons, are supportive of the current regime. That conflict could go on for 20 or 30 years. If it is going to be resolved, it's going to require some kind of huge Bosnia, like the settlement achieved in Dayton, in which fundamentally there are three core groups in Syria: the Sunni Arabs, the non-Sunni Arabs, including the Christians, and the Kurds. Those are the three groupings. The Druze, the Alawites, and the Christians are various kinds of Arab, but not Sunni. You need some kind of institutional resolution that will protect each of these groups. So I'm not saying that there's an imminent Syrian settlement on the horizon, but only those who think in power-sharing terms have any prospects of putting things on the table that might keep Syria together. And lastly, and I promise you it's lastly, because you should always say lastly because it gives your audience hope. Northern Ireland. It gives me immense pleasure that my homeland isn't in the news most of the time. And it isn't in the news because it has a pretty stable power-sharing settlement. The settlement of 1998 achieved parity between the groups, proportionality in key institutions. Each group was left their own educational institutions. They have veto rights on fundamental legislative change. There's a process by which Irish unification can happen or not happen. There are deep institutional linkages between Great Britain and Ireland that underpin the internal power-sharing settlement inside Northern Ireland. Now, of course, one reason why Ireland is successful, it's not just because we're Irish. One reason it's successful is that Northern Ireland is small. The conflict can be damped down by external powers. It's also a conflict in a relatively settled neighbourhood. The Irish government was not sending insurgents into London. The London government was not sending insurgents into Dublin. Those such accusations were made at the time of the conflict, and there may have been one or two freelancing operations. But by and large, the two neighbouring countries were at peace with one another and had a mutual interest in resolving the conflict. But I don't think that successful power sharing simply requires Irish-style conditions. It is a recipe that can work elsewhere. And with that, I leave myself open to interrogation. Gentleman in green.
Anbar awakening.
Sorry? Yeah?
North of Baghdad, right? 2007, started 6 months before there was a surge. Who were the people in the Anbar awakening? Were they Sunnis?
Yes.
If I ask this next question, maybe
Sure.
you can use this as a microcosm almost. Even then, al-Maliki wouldn't include them in the governance, right? And so later, you know, John McCain was big on that. Jeb Bush on the weekend was talking about how great this was of his brother. Even then, and they don't accept them, include them in governance. And isn't that why Barack Obama is no longer going to keep a residual force in Iraq?
Okay, there's lots of things buried in your question. The Sunni Arabs felt most bitter about the American intervention. The Kurds were enthusiastic. The Shiite Arabs were mixed. And the reason they were mixed was that in 1991, America didn't come to their help when they rebelled against Saddam. But they obviously benefited from the new order, particularly when democracy became the rule of the game, and the Shiite parties unified generally. The Sunni parties generally divided, and some didn't participate in elections altogether. The Sunnis were the primary, but not the sole, insurgents against the American presence. And then when you're referring to the Anbar awakening movement, this begins in the west of Iraq, and it's a revolt by the Sunni Arab tribes against the local jihadists, particularly those associated with Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. The local jihadists had made the mistake of stealing women and enforcing marriage on them, raping them, making them their brides. That triggered a reaction, and the Anbar awakening movement mobilized the Sunni Arab tribes against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Americans then supplied what America's very good at, bricks of dollars, to the Anbar awakening movement. And they then mobilized other Sunni Arabs outside of, and with no respect for Iraq's constitution, incidentally. They were in effect building parallel security services in Sunni Arab areas. Now, without cooperating with the Maliki government and the Shiites in this process, this meant that America was building a parallel army for the enemies of the government, which was a very difficult enterprise. So before America's exit, the finesse that was required was somehow to achieve incorporation of the Sunni Arabs. But the American mindset, the American policymaker mindset, including Bush's, including McCain's, including some Democrats, was we need them together in the central government. We need these people who've been killing each other now to come together into joint forces. That was an incredible proposition that has rarely ever been executed in human history. What was far more plausibly likely to be successful was to argue that the Sunni Arabs should police and govern their own areas, and that they should imitate Kurdistan in having greater autonomy, abandon the goal of putting them all into the central federal Iraqi forces, instead let them police their own areas. That way, they would not be vulnerable to attacks by Shiite militia. They would not need the federal Iraqi army, predominantly now Shia, in their areas. So, in my view, the smart strategy was to, having successfully seen the defeat of Al-Qaeda in Iraq through the mobilization of the Sunni Arab tribes, that was the moment to go for deepening the federalization of Iraq, not for deepening its centralization. And that is not the argument that American policymakers are having now. Right? The argument is, who lost the war? Was it you or was it me? And it's actually irrelevant to the circumstances on the ground.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Gentleman at the back.
I wanted to ask a question about the situation in Ukraine and the possibilities of power sharing, which is, doesn't it potentially preclude some kinds of policy opportunities going forward? For instance, joining the EU. Right. I mean, it's my understanding that the Ukrainian government, before all of this happened, looked favorably on the idea of joining the EU. In fact, it was their initiative to join the EU. It's not like they were being prodded into EU membership. So if you had some sort of power sharing agreement within the nation state, that power, I mean, you were talking about what makes the situation in Northern Ireland work, is that you have this EU, right? You have a sort of socioeconomic, political background that's the, let's say, the game board on which all the players are operating. The Ukrainian situation strikes me as different because they seem to be at the dividing line between two different game boards. So how do you envision that?
Well, I think your description is very accurate. I would want to make a few reservations. One is, yes, one part of the Ukrainian political system, largely focused on the West, but not only in the West. Very pro-European integration, very pro-Ukraine's eventual membership of NATO. That was the group who, if we wind back the clock 20 years, in order to achieve Ukrainian independence, said, yes, we must recognize Crimea's distinctiveness and autonomy. It's here by accident, Khrushchev's gift. We must protect the Russian language in the East. Yes, those are our fellow Ukrainian citizens, even though they're Russian speakers in the East. We have economic differences with them, but they're part of us. And accordingly, we're not going to make Ukraine the way the French made France. We're not going to absolutely impose the Ukrainian language, and we're not going to force those Russians to become Ukrainians, because we realize there will be a conflict. But my point is that what they did after their recent revolution was to raise all those, precisely those fears. And this was accompanied by maximum feasible European Union incompetence in its foreign policy, because if you start making very clear signals to Ukraine that it's possible you'll go into the EU, then there's a very clear historical record. No new post-communist member has joined the European Union without previously joining NATO. And the very fact that that has happened is a standing Russian grievance. They believe they got promise, whether it's true or not, they believe that they got promises made to Mikhail Gorbachev at the time German unification was permitted, that there would not be a general expansion of NATO. But here it looked like the normal pattern would be reversed. The EU would go in, eventually Ukraine would become part of the EU, and then NATO would arrive afterwards, sparking off maximum feasible Russian fears. So I attribute the conflict, the triggering of the bad things that have happened to the overconfidence of the new Ukrainian elite in conjunction with wildly careless European, but also American diplomacy. No effort was made to minimize the possibility that there would be a revolt of the Russophones. And that basically gave Putin his causes, and he's exploited them fully.
I completely agree, but I guess my question had more to do with, you have a power sharing agreement.
Right. So,
hopefully you take Russia out of that equation eventually, and you have
yes.
a sort of national government in which you have a Russian ethnic group, a Ukrainian Russian ethnic group, working with a Ukrainian.
Absolutely.
They're looking eastward and westward.
Correct, and that makes it extraordinarily difficult. And in my view, and this is not a popular view among Ukrainian nationalists, the settlement has to be that Ukraine is permanently neutral. So it will never go into NATO. And that gives the Russians at least some degree of security. Most of the invasions that have occurred through their history have occurred through Ukraine. It's their soft belly. And however paranoid their fears might be, they're their fears. We can't say you shouldn't have those fears. Those are their fears. So for that reason, a key part of the settlement would be neutrality. And it's not an accident that some of the most successful power-sharing settlements occur in neutral countries. Austria, Ireland, Switzerland, and so on. Gentleman here.
It seems to me that you've minimized the importance of religion in the great problems of the world nowadays.
To repeat the question, it seems I've minimized the importance of religion in the great problems of the world nowadays. Yes, but I've done so not for religious reasons. I do not have religious convictions myself, but I find God generally not guilty for the current incidents of violence in the world. Yes, there are jihadist militants in combat. Yes, all over the world you can find people who have religious commitments engaged in violence. But in general, unless that violence is linked to a national or an ethnic grievance or cause, it has little long-term purchase. You can even interpret ISIS and its recent successes in Syria and Iraq in these terms. Yes, I know they say they want a caliphate, which is a non-ethnic global empire for all Muslims. But look at where they have their support. Their support is primarily in the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq and the Sunni Arab areas of Syria. The fertile soil is in two locations where the Sunni Arabs either feel they should have majority power, as in Syria, or they have been displaced from a position of dominance, as in Iraq. Without that underlying local, state-based grievance of exclusion in both cases, I don't think ISIS would have successfully fertilized and grown. You're doubtful. That's okay. Now, I am not giving a blank check. I'm not saying that religions are all peaceful. Nonsense. Religions are multivocal. They include those who can use religious doctrine for war and to treat people as heretical and to exclude, oppress, and torture them. But religions also have resources for cooperation and peace. They're not one thing or the other.
Well, you know, I took a course here at the university on the evolution of the universe, physics course. And the professor asked, what's the difference between science and religion? And as a scientist myself, I felt that you postulate a theory and then you do an experiment, you either prove or disprove the theory.
Yes.
And he said, no, that's not correct. He said, religion cannot be disproved. And so that's the problem. I think that religion cannot be disproved, and there will always be problems as who's to right and who's wrong, and that's, I think, insoluble.
I don't any longer imagine, like the teenager I was, that there can be a world with no religion. But I do not think that religion itself is primarily responsible for most of the violence we find in the world. That's probably where we differ. Yes?
Can you tell us something about intervention? It usually, it seems to be a big issue with us, and it seems often to go awry, whether it's because we don't really understand the situation that they're intervening in, or just, would it be better if we never intervened at all? What do you think?
It's actually very difficult to generalize. Yes, the question was about interventions. Are interventions things that we should not do? Are they things that we should do better? Are they things that we're particularly bad at doing? The literature here is very inconclusive. There are examples of briefly very successful interventions. So the removal of Idi Amin from power in Uganda by Julius Nyereri's army. Most people think that that was a very good intervention against a very, very brutal dictator. Unhappily, Nyerere put in power Milton Obote, who proved to be hardly an inclusive president. But he did stop some of the worst conduct by Idi Amin. The Vietnamese intervention in Kampuchea, which we all, meaning we all, the democratic world, opposed, stopped the genocide of the Khmer Rouge against fellow Khmers and against minorities. That was a successful intervention, but rarely recognized as such by the world. The United States has, in the post-Cold War world, it was initially a reluctant interventionist. It's difficult to recall now, but the Clinton administration had to be dragged in screaming into Bosnia and Herzegovina. They didn't want to get involved. They got involved only when the Europeans proved to be disunited and dysfunctional, incapable of getting in. And that is one of the truly important problems of the contemporary democratic world, that the US wants to go in generally with allies. When it chose not to go in with allies in Iraq, it was worse than when it went in with allies, as it did in Afghanistan and some other places. It wants to go in with allies, but if you go in with allies, you're a multi-headed, incoherent creature. And you have to negotiate among yourselves as well as with the locals. And the one thing that nobody ever has is anything approximating a good power-sharing plan. They might have plans for democracy, for women's rights, for how you get clean government, but they never have a power-sharing plan. And to the extent that they do, it's off-the-shelf version of the US Constitution or something else. Even then, there's remarkable incompetence. So here's a story you can read about, and it's true, in the memoir of my colleague who worked with me in Kurdistan, Peter Galbraith's book on the end of Iraq, How American Incompetence Created a War Without End. That was his subtitle. A mistake. Iraq has not yet ended. There may have been American incompetence, but there is never any war without end. But what he tells there is a very interesting story. Ambassador Bremer, you may recall, was appointed as the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority. His experience was, if I recall correctly, as ambassador to the Netherlands, which had a history of power sharing. He came to Iraq with a mixture of American assumptions and assumptions from his brief period as being an ambassador. It was extraordinary the level of ignorance he displayed, even about his own country's constitutional history. And the most spectacular example of this is as follows. The Kurds wanted Iraq's constitution to be ratified by the Kurdistan region and by provinces, a federal ratification process. A majority in the country and a majority in each of the provinces and or regions. Ambassador Bremer said, no country ever ratifies its constitution by provinces. He had to be given a copy of the United States Constitution to show that the United States Constitution had come into being through a ratification process involving state conventions and so on. So one of the stunning things for me is the remarkable, and I'm not choosing to pick on him, but if you are going to intervene, you've got to intervene with the right people, with the right kinds of information, with the right kinds of powers, with the right kind of allies. And you have to have a plan to get out, but not too quickly and not too late. So we're all still in Bosnia, meaning the European Union and the United States. Bosnia had a set of institutions negotiated at Dayton, but instead of allowing the locals to bear the costs of those new institutions, if they had disagreements, instead of letting them suffer from the stagnation and deadlock and prompt them to resolve it themselves, instead we have a high commissioner who steps in and whenever there's deadlock makes the decision. So they become infantilized and they never actually try and make their institutions work. So it is extraordinarily difficult. So I would say that there isn't, you can set a whole set of ideal conditions that are necessary for a successful intervention. But what I would want to say is this. We must preserve the willingness to intervene against genocide and ethnic expulsion. And we have to make those internationally outlawed in a meaningful way so that anybody who starts doing it suffers an effective removal, at least the blockage of what they're doing. That would require, however, the building of an independent UN capability, a force that could be deployed at the discretion of the Security Council for those functions and only those functions. That's still worth doing. Today, the UN it's just like the Wild West. If there's a conflict erupts and you need UN peacekeepers, it's like collecting a posse. And you end up, you bribe the Bangladeshis to come because their soldiers will get a decent rate. And there's no coherent, unified force with an express doctrine of how to conduct itself. It's a mess. We can do better.
Well, it seems that we need both an art and a science, so I think we have...
Sure. Yes?
One more question. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the probability of success with our U.S. negotiations with Iran. How successful do you think we might be in getting an agreement and ultimately the outcome of that agreement? And it would really help if you would use the microphone.
Sorry, you can't hear me? Oh, I apologize. Sorry. I was told the microphone would work if I walked out. I'm not an expert on nuclear questions, and I'm not an expert on Iran. What I do think is that it's plausible that you could get a resolution through negotiations with Iran, and I think it's highly implausible that you could get a resolution other than through negotiations. That is to say, I don't think it would be smart, intelligent, wise, or prudent to, for example, encourage Israel unilaterally to take out alleged Iranian nuclear weapons bases. If we were to encourage or endorse that, we would then guarantee the continuing enmity of the Iranians as well as most of the Arab world. You should minimize the number of enemies you have at any one particular time, if you can prudently do so. The second thing is, I do believe that domestically in Iran, the new president and those who voted for him want Iran back in the wider world. It's difficult for Americans to appreciate this, but Iranians regard themselves as one of the world's civilizations. From the time of Darius and Xerxes onward to the present day. And they are a major presence in the region and hugely culturally influential. And if their price of getting in is one in which their pride can be protected, they have the capacity to build the weapons, they're recognized as having that capacity, but in return, for not doing so, they achieve recognition, they're brought into world forums, the sanctions end, and there's some credible mechanism for monitoring whether or not they are engaged in subsequent development. That would be a good outcome. Can it be achieved? I do not know. Is it worth trying? Yes, is my answer. But I didn't tell you it's going to succeed.
Said we are going to annihilate Israel is still there. Do you think there's a change in his outlook, or do you think he might be influenced, as you just indicated, to back off from that threat?
I think there is a ferocious form of anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli rhetoric indulged in frequently by Iranian politicians. Some of them believe it. Others, it's mere rabble-rousing. I think that if you're an Iranian and your strategic desire is to break up Israel and prevent it from continuing to exist, even if you are filled with enormous hatred The smart way to break Israel is not through attacking it with nuclear weapons, which would only guarantee Iran's total destruction. The smart way is a political way to mobilize forces against Israel and the way Israel treats its Palestinian minority. That's the smart way. And I think there are more smart people in Iran than stupid people.
Thank you.
I'm sure there are many more questions, but I know that you have to get back.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for lending this much time to us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
We're honored.
Thank you.